For decades, Riverside County in Southern California was seen as nothing more than farmland and silence. The fields stretched out endlessly, dotted with banana groves and orange orchards, and life moved at the slow rhythm of seasons. People locked their doors only at nightfall, not out of fear, but out of habit. This was the kind of place where neighbors still greeted each other at the general store, and where gossip revolved around crop prices, not crime. It was this image of tranquility that made what happened in the small town of Fairview so unthinkable. Behind the rows of banana trees on a modest 5-acre property lived a man named Thomas Greer, a farmer in his early 60s. With his wiry frame, sun-creased face, and quiet demeanor, Thomas looked every bit the hard-working American grower. He wore the same faded overalls every day, drove an old Ford pickup, and nodded politely whenever he crossed paths with townsfolk. He and his wife Martha were known as reserved, almost shy. They sold produce at the weekend farmers market, accepted cash only, and never stayed to chat long. But what the townspeople could not imagine was that Thomas and Martha's banana grove hid a secret darker than anything Hollywood could ever script. For 3 years, behind the neat rows of plants, the Greers committed acts so grotesque that they would later be called the bananas of death case in American headlines. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly. In late 1997, a drifter named Eleanor Brooks was last seen walking along Highway 74, thumbing for a ride into town. Locals didn't think much of it. Fairview had always been a place people passed through. But when Eleanor never appeared again, not at the bus station, not at a shelter, not anywhere, her disappearance was filed away as just another transient gone missing. Months later, a mechanic named Daniel Harper, who had occasionally helped Thomas fix his old tractor, also vanished. He told his family he'd stop by the Greer farm to pick up some spare parts Thomas promised him. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. Rumors circulated quietly. Maybe Daniel ran off because of debt. Maybe he got mixed up in trouble. No one connected the dots. Not yet. Meanwhile, neighbors occasionally whispered about odd things at the Greer property. The sound of shovels clanging against dirt well past midnight, the heavy, metallic odor drifting over the fields on humid nights, a smell too strong to be just fertilizer. Martha seen carrying bundles into the grove, only to return empty-handed. But no one asked questions aloud. Fairview was small, and people minded their own business. It wasn't until 2000 that the nightmare surfaced. A group of teenagers sneaking into the grove on a dare stumbled across a shallow pit partly washed open by rain. Inside, half covered in red California clay, was a skeleton, its arms twisted unnaturally, its teeth still gleaming under the moonlight. The sheriff's department descended on the grove the next morning. Officers in Navy uniforms cordoned off the land, their flashlights cutting through the dense leaves. As the digging began, grave after grave was unearthed. Skeletons stacked like firewood, some stripped bare, others still clinging to fragments of clothing. By the time investigators counted, the number of remains reached double digits. The town was paralyzed with shock. People who had bought bananas and bread from the Greers every Saturday were suddenly confronted with the possibility that they had shaken hands with murderers. How could a man like Thomas, frail, courteous, barely taller than 5'5", have committed such horrors? How could Martha, who knitted sweaters and baked pies, have been complicit? Detective Samuel Carter, the lead investigator, would later describe the scene as a graveyard disguised as farmland. The grove itself seemed to mock them, green leaves swaying gently above, while the soil below reeked of death. And in the middle of it all, Thomas and Martha Greer stood silently as officers placed them in handcuffs. Their faces were unreadable, neither angry nor remorseful, as though they had simply been caught breaking some small-town rule. The press swarmed almost instantly. Reporters camped at the police station, demanding answers. CNN ran the headline, "The Bananas of Death, America's Most Shocking Farm Murders." For the people of Fairview, life would never be the same again. The sleepy little town was now etched into true crime history. Yet the question remained, why? What could drive two seemingly ordinary farmers to bury dozens of lives under their own soil? To understand, investigators had to peel back decades of hidden history, beginning not in the fields of California, but in the broken childhood of Thomas Greer himself. Before the newspapers dubbed him the Banana Butcher, Thomas Greer was simply known as Tommy, the only son of a broken family in Appalachia, West Virginia. Born in 1941 to a coal miner and a frail seamstress, Tommy's life began in shadows. His father, Raymond Greer, was a hard, brutal man who worked the mines by day and drank himself into rages by night. His mother, Clara, had little strength to protect her children from the fists and curses that filled the one-room shack they called home. From an early age, Tommy learned two lessons that would shape him. Silence kept you safe, and cruelty got results. At just 8 years old, he witnessed his father beat a neighbor's dog to death with a shovel simply because it barked too loudly. Tommy never forgot the way the animal's cries echoed into the hills, or the satisfaction on his father's face as silence fell. His only sibling, a younger sister named Mary, tried to shield him from the worst of Raymond's wrath. She would read him bedtime stories by candlelight, whispering that life could be better, that one day they would escape the suffocating town. But Mary herself became the target of their father's darkest impulses. By the time she turned 13, neighbors whispered that Raymond's violence had crossed into unspeakable abuse. One winter morning, Mary disappeared. Clara claimed she had gone to live with relatives in Ohio, but no one ever saw her again. For Tommy, the disappearance of his sister was the breaking point. He stopped speaking at school. Teachers described him as vacant, a boy staring through walls. Yet, when provoked, his eruptions were terrifying. In one incident, he cornered a classmate in the schoolyard and strangled him until the boy turned purple, releasing him only when a teacher intervened. No punishment seemed to change him. Instead, Tommy grew quieter, colder, more detached. At 17, after his father was crushed in a mining accident, Tommy left West Virginia with nothing but a duffel bag. He drifted from state to state, taking odd jobs: farmhand in Kentucky, truck loader in Missouri, mechanic's assistant in Oklahoma. Always solitary, always guarded. Wherever he went, rumors followed. Workers going missing, strange smells near the fields where he camped, tools covered in rust that wasn't quite rust. But Tommy was clever. He never stayed long enough for suspicion to grow into evidence. It wasn't until he reached California in the early 1970s that he finally settled. He met Martha Jennings, a waitress in Bakersfield with her own troubled past. Martha had grown up with an alcoholic mother and had bounced between foster homes. By the time she met Thomas, she was desperate for stability. He provided that, at least on the surface. His quiet nature felt safe to her, a contrast to the chaos of her childhood. They married in 1975 and bought a small patch of farmland outside Fairview. To the world, they were unremarkable. A hard-working couple growing bananas and selling at markets. But inside their marriage, darkness fermented. Martha, isolated and emotionally dependent on Thomas, became both accomplice and enabler. Whatever twisted urges Thomas confessed in whispers, she absorbed without protest. In time, she participated. Detective Samuel Carter, years later, would argue that Martha's compliance was not just survival, but complicity. She didn't just turn a blind eye, he told reporters. She held the shovel, she carried the bodies. What exactly flipped the switch from suppressed violence to outright murder remains debated. Some experts point to the unresolved trauma of his sister's disappearance and his father's brutality. Others suggest Martha's influence provided the final push, that together, their isolation turned into a breeding ground for psychopathy. The first known victim in California was Eleanor Brooks, the drifter who vanished in 1997. But Carter's team later unearthed chilling journals hidden beneath the floorboards of the Greer farmhouse. In neat, almost childlike handwriting, Thomas had recorded fantasies of killing stretching back to his teenage years. Phrases like "silence is clean" and "they stop moving and it feels like home" repeated again and again. Perhaps most disturbing were the entries about Mary, his missing sister. "She left me with him," one page read. "But when I take their breath, I get her back." To prosecutors, these journals revealed the mind of a man who never escaped his childhood trauma, but instead replayed it on new victims. By the late 1990s, with Martha at his side, Thomas Greer had finally found the perfect stage for his madness: the banana grove. Its dense leaves and sprawling fields offered privacy. Its soil was soft, easy to dig. And in a town where people minded their business, screams in the night could be dismissed as coyotes or drunken arguments. When the bodies were uncovered in 2000, psychologists scrambled to explain how a boy from West Virginia could become the monster of Riverside. Some argued nurture, the abuse and neglect. Others argued nature, an innate evil. But for the families of the victims, such debates meant little. What mattered was that their loved ones had ended up in shallow graves beneath banana trees, victims of a man whose past no one had ever truly understood. And for Fairview, the revelation that Thomas Greer's childhood horrors had metastasized into community-wide terror was almost too much to bear. Because if a boy like Tommy could grow up into the banana butcher, then perhaps monsters weren't born in the shadows at all. They were raised in the daylight, right under everyone's noses. By the summer of 1999, the Greer farm had already swallowed its share of secrets, though no one in Fairview suspected it. What began with the disappearance of Eleanor Brooks did not end there. The quiet banana grove, with its whispering leaves and soft red soil, became a hunting ground, a stage for horrors carefully concealed beneath an ordinary life. That July, Daniel Harper, a friendly mechanic known for his easy laugh, drove out to the Greer property to help Thomas fix a tractor. He told his wife he'd be home before dinner. She set the table, waiting for him, but the hours passed into silence. His truck was later found parked crookedly on the edge of the farm, the driver's door left open, the keys still dangling in the ignition. Neighbors searched the nearby creek, convinced he had suffered some accident, but they found nothing. It wasn't until years later, when investigators dug into the grove, that his skeleton surfaced, ribs twisted and pierced with metal bolts, a grotesque echo of his trade. The discovery suggested that Thomas had not only murdered him but toyed with his body, as though the mechanic's craft could be mocked even in death. Months later, another disappearance sent ripples through the county. A teenage runaway named Crystal James was last seen thumbing a ride along the interstate. A witness recalled a blue Ford pickup slowing beside her, its driver a small man with a weathered face. No one questioned it then. Hitchhiking was dangerous. Everyone knew that. But when Crystal's body never appeared, her case was dismissed as another lost runaway. Only later, when police uncovered shallow pits scattered through the grove, did they realize the scale of her suffering. Bones separated, buried in different places, fragments of her young life torn apart and hidden like broken toys. In Martha's dresser drawer, detectives found a lock of Crystal's blonde hair braided neatly with a ribbon. It was the kind of thing a mother might keep as a keepsake, but here it was transformed into a chilling token of complicity. By 1999, the pattern deepened. A drifter couple, Mark and Joanne Wilcox, wandered into town after their car broke down. They were seen asking for directions to the nearest motel, but no one recalled them ever checking in. The Greer farm, with its promise of shelter and a friendly offer of food, became their last stop. Their bodies were later exhumed from a single grave, lying side by side, skulls fractured by blunt force. Investigators found their rib cages stuffed with stones and soil, as though Thomas had tried to anchor them permanently to the earth. No one could explain why. Some psychologists would later suggest it was ritual, others thought it was pure sadism. Either way, it revealed a mind not only bent on killing, but on staging the dead like objects in a twisted play. Not even neighbors were safe. In March of 1999, Nancy O'Connell, a widow known for her warm smile and homemade jam, vanished after telling friends she planned to bring preserves to the Greers. For weeks, search parties combed the woods, convinced she had fallen into the creek or been attacked by a coyote. Her car turned up abandoned, her purse inside, but no trace of her. When her remains were finally unearthed from the grove, they were found upright, arms bound, as though she had been buried standing. In her skeletal hands were rosary beads, clutched so tightly that they remained entwined with her fingers decades later. The image haunted even the most hardened officers, proof that she had prayed until the soil consumed her. As these disappearances mounted, the community whispered. People noted the clanging of shovels after midnight, the acrid smell drifting across fields on humid nights, the way Martha carried heavy sacks toward the grove. Yet suspicion dissolved into silence. Fairview was small, and nobody wanted to accuse their neighbors, especially not the quiet couple who sold them bananas and bread every Saturday. Evil, they thought, was something that lived in cities, not in the soil of Riverside County. Inside the farmhouse, the truth was darker still. Beneath the floorboards, notebooks were later found filled with childish handwriting and crude sketches of human bodies. Phrases like silence is pure and roots must drink repeated page after page. In the barn, boxes of trinkets lined the shelves: wedding rings, necklaces, scraps of fabric, even teeth. Each item cataloged, labeled with initials. Martha, it seemed, had helped preserve them, treating these grotesque trophies as though they were mementos from a vacation, not reminders of the dead. The final victim before the secret unraveled was a traveling salesman named Howard Klein. He had stopped by the farm in early 2000, offering to sell agricultural equipment. His body was discovered months later, roots from young banana plants curling through his ribcage, fusing man and soil into a single grotesque monument. By then, the grove held more than a dozen lives. And yet, life in Fairview carried on. People bought bananas. Children waved at Thomas as he drove by. And no one imagined that just beyond the tidy rows of trees lay a cemetery built by human hands. It was fate, and perhaps foolish bravado, that finally tore the mask away. A group of teenagers, daring each other to sneak into the farm one stormy night, stumbled across the half-exposed skeleton of a woman, her jaw tilted open as if frozen mid-scream. The next morning, sirens shattered the quiet of Fairview, and the grove that had stood for decades as a picture of rural calm was stripped bare. Its soil bleeding secrets too monstrous to hide any longer. The morning after the teenagers stumbled into the grove, the quiet of Fairview shattered beneath the wail of sirens. Patrol cars lined the dusty road leading to the Greer property, their lights cutting through the mist. Deputies moved cautiously among the banana trees, marking off the ground with yellow tape, their boots sinking into the soft, damp soil. Within hours, the scene swarmed with investigators, reporters, and horrified locals pressing against the barriers, desperate to glimpse what had been unearthed. Detective Samuel Carter, a veteran of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, was the first to descend into the shallow pit. What he saw would remain etched into his memory. The half-exposed skeleton of a woman, jaw frozen wide as if screaming into eternity, one arm twisted awkwardly above her head. Around her, the soil was dark and clotted, carrying the faint metallic tang of decay. Carter ordered a full excavation. What began as one grave quickly turned into a chain of them. By the end of that first day, 4 sets of human remains had been recovered. Within a week, the number had climbed into double digits. The Greers were arrested that same morning without resistance. Thomas stood on the porch in his faded overalls, hands folded calmly in front of him, as if waiting for guests rather than deputies. Martha, pale and trembling, clutched a dish towel until an officer pried it from her hands. Neither resisted the handcuffs. As neighbors gathered in stunned silence, the couple was led past the rows of banana plants, the same rows where their victims lay, and into waiting patrol cars. Some onlookers shouted curses. Others simply stared, unable to reconcile the image of the polite farmers with the horrors whispered about on police radios. Inside the farmhouse, detectives uncovered the depth of the nightmare. The living room seemed ordinary, but beneath the floorboards were hidden journals filled with crude drawings and obsessive phrases. The barn reeked of mold and iron. Here, investigators discovered boxes of trophies, rings, necklaces, scraps of fabric, and even small bones, each meticulously labeled. In Martha's dresser drawer lay the braided lock of Crystal James's hair, tied with a ribbon. The kitchen revealed knives honed to a shine, their blades bearing traces that would later test positive for human tissue. It was a grotesque museum, curated not by accident but by choice. The press descended like vultures. Satellite trucks parked along the highway, reporters broadcasting live updates under headlines that blazed across America. The bananas of death, the grove of silence, farm couple charged in mass killings. CNN, NBC, even tabloids filled their broadcasts with the story of Thomas and Martha Greer, the quiet farmers who had turned their land into a graveyard. Fairview, once unknown to the outside world, became a name synonymous with horror. Detective Carter and his team worked day and night, piecing together the pattern of disappearances. Each name connected to the Greers in some way: a mechanic who came to help with equipment, a runaway offered a ride, a neighbor delivering preserves, a salesman peddling farm tools. Every encounter ended the same way, with silence and a shallow grave. Forensic teams mapped the grove with laser precision, marking each site with small numbered flags until the plantation looked less like farmland and more like a battlefield. Interviews with townsfolk revealed years of overlooked warnings. Neighbors recalled hearing shovels clanging in the night, seeing Martha haul heavy sacks into the grove, smelling the acrid stench drifting across fields in summer. Yet none had pressed further. In a place where privacy was sacred, where suspicion was seen as betrayal, silence had given Thomas and Martha cover. That silence now weighed heavily on every conscience in Fairview. As the investigation deepened, so did the public's fascination. Talk shows debated whether Thomas was born a monster or shaped by his brutal past. Psychologists speculated about Martha. Was she a victim, a woman manipulated into compliance, or a willing accomplice who found power in shared cruelty? Newspapers printed side-by-side photos of her at church bake sales and the lock of blonde hair in her drawer, demanding answers. The victims' families, many of whom had long given up hope of closure, flocked to Riverside. They stood behind police lines as excavations continued, weeping as detectives carried out skeletal remains wrapped in tarps. For them, closure was poisoned by the grotesque reality of what their loved ones had endured. One mother, upon learning her son's bones had been found bound in wire, collapsed in grief, whispering, "He prayed. I know he prayed." In jail, Thomas remained unnervingly calm. During interrogation, he spoke little, answering questions with shrugs or short sentences. At one point, when asked why he had done it, he simply said, "The earth needed feeding." Martha wept during her questioning, but her tears did not sway detectives. She admitted carrying sacks, admitted digging, but claimed Thomas forced her, that she had been too afraid to resist. Yet the trophies in her dresser, the hair, the scraps of clothing told another story, one of participation, not coercion. By the time the full scope of the investigation was revealed, the count of victims reached at least 13, with the possibility of more. Some graves were too degraded to identify, others held only fragments. The official toll would never be certain, but the narrative was clear. For 3 years, beneath the leaves of banana trees swaying gently in the California breeze, Thomas and Martha Greer had run one of the most chilling killing grounds in American history. The town of Fairview recoiled under the weight of infamy. Shops shuttered, church attendance dwindled, children were kept inside after dark. Tourists drove past to snap photos of the crime scene tape, gawking at the place that had once been just another farm. The land itself seemed cursed, a scar on the earth that no harvest could cleanse. And as the Greers awaited trial, locked away in county jail, the people of Fairview were left with the same gnawing question that haunted the detectives. How had such evil lived so close, so unnoticed, for so long? The trial of Thomas and Martha Greer began in the spring of 2001, drawing crowds to the Riverside County Courthouse that rivaled any celebrity scandal. Reporters camped outside in tents, sketch artists filled their pads with grim expressions, and satellite vans jammed the parking lots. Inside, the air was thick with tension, every bench occupied by townsfolk, victim families, and strangers lured by morbid fascination. For Fairview, this was not just a trial, it was the reckoning of its soul. Thomas was led into court in a faded orange jumpsuit, his wrists bound, his face unreadable. He sat with the posture of a man who had accepted his fate, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on the wooden table before him. Martha entered separately, smaller, thinner than neighbors remembered, her hair tied back neatly as though clinging to some shred of normalcy. She cried quietly as the charges were read, her voice breaking when asked if she understood. 13 counts of murder, multiple counts of desecration of human remains, conspiracy. The courtroom seemed to shrink under the weight of those words. The prosecution painted a picture of cold calculation. Photos of the graves, the bones, the trophies displayed in plastic bags, all were laid out for the jury. Jurors flinched as they were shown images of Nancy O'Connell's upright skeleton, her rosary beads still tangled in bone. They listened to the trembling testimony of parents who had searched for their children in vain, of the mechanic's widow who described setting the dinner table that night and waiting until dawn for a husband who would never return. But it was the journals that silenced the room. Prosecutors read aloud Thomas's scrawled words. "Silence is pure. Roots must drink. They stop moving, and I feel alive. Each phrase cut through the air like a blade. The defense argued insanity, claiming his violent childhood and untreated trauma left him incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. They painted him as a broken boy who had never escaped the ghosts of Appalachia. But the cold organization of his trophies, the meticulous notes, the calculated burial rituals told another story, that of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and took satisfaction in it. Martha's defense was more complicated. Her attorneys insisted she was a victim, a battered wife manipulated into compliance, too afraid to resist Thomas's demands. They pointed to her tearful confessions during interrogation, her trembling hands in the courtroom. Yet the evidence worked against her. The lock of Crystal's hair in her drawer, the labeled boxes in the barn, the neighbors who had seen her carrying sacks into the grove. If fear had guided her, it had not stopped her from participating. The prosecution suggested she was not merely an accessory, but a partner, drawn into Thomas's rituals and corrupted by them. She carried the shovel, one attorney declared, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. She chose silence over humanity, and in that silence, lives were lost. Detective Samuel Carter took the stand, recounting the night the grove was opened, the sickly smell of decay, the line of graves stretching out like a map of death. His words carried weight, not because they were dramatic, but because they were restrained. The jury could see the toll in his eyes, the lines etched deeper from sleepless nights. It wasn't just murder, he said quietly. It was desecration. It was turning human life into soil. When Thomas himself was finally asked to testify, the room held its breath. He spoke in a low monotone, each word deliberate, as though rehearsed in silence for years. I fed the earth, he said. They were noise. I made them quiet. Martha helped because she understood. The judge cut him off before he could continue, but the damage was done. His lack of remorse, his framing of murder as some twisted act of necessity, sealed his fate. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 2 days. Thomas Greer was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death by lethal injection. Martha received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As the gavel struck, families wept, some in relief, others in anguish, knowing that no sentence could resurrect the lives lost beneath the grove. In Fairview, the aftermath lingered like smoke after a fire. The farm was seized by the state, the banana grove razed to bare soil. For months, people avoided the road leading past the property, unwilling to confront the emptiness where horror had once thrived. Some families moved away entirely, unable to raise children in a place that had become infamous across the nation. Others stayed, determined to reclaim the land with their presence, but the shadow of the Greers never fully lifted. Television specials aired, documentaries were produced, and true crime books dissected every detail of the case. The name The Bananas of Death entered American folklore, a cautionary tale whispered in classrooms and on dark porches. Yet for those who had lived beside the Greers, no retelling could match the betrayal of realizing that evil had worn the face of a neighbor. Detective Carter, in one of his final interviews before retirement, summed it up best. The scariest monsters aren't hiding in cities or prisons. They're the ones who wave at you on your way to church. They're the ones you buy bread from at the market. That's why the Greers will haunt Fairview forever, not just for what they did, but for how normal they looked while doing it. And so the grove stood no more, but its memory lingered. The wind still whispered through the empty fields, carrying with it echoes of prayers, screams, and the silence Thomas Greer prized above all else. For Fairview, there would never be true quiet again.